Between 1943 and 1945, thousands of babies were born in a place that, according to the United States government, did not exist. Their birth certificates listed no city, no county, no hospital. Under place of birth, each one read the same thing: P.O. Box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Not a town, not a street, a post office box. As if these children had been delivered not into a community with homes and sidewalks and a hospital ward, but into an envelope. That post office box was the only official address for an entire city, a city of laboratories and dormitories, of a commissary and a theater and a school, of more Nobel laureates per square mile than any place on earth. A city where the population eventually swelled past 6,000, where families hung laundry on lines strung between hastily built apartments, where children rode bicycles down unpaved roads, where some of the most brilliant minds in the history of physics gathered every evening to argue and drink and square dance in a log lodge that had belonged only months earlier to a boys' boarding school. None of it appeared on any map. The city had no name that the outside world was permitted to know. Its residents could not say where they lived, could not tell their own parents, could not receive mail addressed to anything but that box in Santa Fe. For more than 2 years, the United States government hid an entire city on a mesa in the mountains of northern New Mexico, and the most remarkable thing about it may be this: it worked. The story begins, as so many stories about hidden things do, with a man who already knew where to look. J. Robert Oppenheimer was a theoretical physicist from New York, thin and intense and given to reading the Bhagavad Gita in the original Sanskrit, and he had fallen in love with northern New Mexico when he was 18 years old. In the summer of 1922, recovering from a bout of illness, he had been sent west to a dude ranch near the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The landscape seized him. The mesas, the ponderosa forests, the enormous sky, the quality of the light at 7,000 feet. He came back summer after summer. He leased a small cabin in the Pecos Valley that he called Perro Caliente, hot dog, roughly, and rode horses through the Jemez Mountains with his brother Frank. He knew the high country the way a man knows a place that saved his life, which is to say, with a loyalty that outlasted logic. 20 years later, in the fall of 1942, Oppenheimer was no longer just a physicist with a teaching position at Berkeley. He had been appointed the scientific director of a project so secret it didn't have a public name. Only a bureaucratic designation, the Manhattan Engineer District, which would come to be known simply as the Manhattan Project. The goal was to build an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany did. And the question Oppenheimer needed to answer immediately, before the first equation was solved or the first gram of uranium was refined, was where. The work required isolation, security, and enough space for laboratories, machine shops, and housing for what he initially estimated would be about 30 scientists and their families. It needed to be remote enough that an accident, and the nature of the work made accidents entirely plausible, would not endanger a populated area. It needed to be somewhere the military could control every road in and out. General Leslie Groves, the Army engineer who ran the military side of the project, was a man who made decisions the way other men ate lunch, quickly, without much sentiment, and with the confidence that he could always order another. He had already rejected several potential sites. A location in the desert outside Reno was too accessible. A site in Southern California was too close to the coast. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, was already designated for uranium enrichment and couldn't absorb another mission. Groves and Oppenheimer visited a canyon site near Jemez Springs, New Mexico, in mid-November 1942. But Groves found the canyon walls confining. Bad for security, he said, because the surrounding ridges offered too many vantage points. It was Oppenheimer who suggested they drive a little farther, up a winding road to a mesa he remembered from his summers in the mountains. There was a boys' school up there, he said, a ranch school, good buildings, total isolation, one road in, one road out. The Los Alamos Ranch School sat on the Pajarito Plateau, a broad volcanic mesa, roughly 7,300 feet above sea level, rimmed by canyons and backed by the high peaks of the Jemez Range. It had been founded in 1917 by a man named Ashley Pond II, who believed, with the conviction common to a certain kind of early 20th century American, that fresh air and hard physical labor could cure the ailments of sickly boys from wealthy Eastern families. The school was small, rarely enrolling more than 40 or 50 students at a time, and deliberately rugged. Boys slept on screened porches open to the mountain air, rode horses daily, and wore shorts year-round, even through New Mexico winters. The tuition was steep, around $2,400 a year, which in the 1930s was more than most Americans earned, and the alumni list reflected it. William S. Burroughs had attended briefly. So had Gore Vidal. The campus was handsome, log and stone buildings set among the ponderosa pines, with views that stretched 60 miles across the Rio Grande Valley to the Sangre de Cristo Range. The main building, Fuller Lodge, was a massive structure built in 1928, its walls made of nearly 800 hand-peeled ponderosa logs, with a great stone fireplace and a dining hall that could seat the entire school. Groves took one look at the mesa and made his decision. The plateau was isolated, accessible by a single unpaved road that could be gated and guarded. The canyons on three sides were natural barriers better than any fence. The existing buildings, the lodge, the dormitories, the masters' houses, could serve as the nucleus of a laboratory compound, while new construction went up around them. The school would have to go. In December 1942, the War Department sent a letter to the headmaster, A.J. Connell, informing him that the school's property was being acquired by the federal government under the Second War Powers Act. The purchase price was $440,000 for the entire property, the buildings, the land, the horses, the tack, everything. There was no negotiation. Connell, who had served as headmaster since 1933 and had devoted his professional life to the school, was reportedly devastated. The students were to be gone by February 1943. Boys wrote letters home. Parents arranged transfers to other schools. The last classes were held in late January. The final horseback rides went out along the canyon rim, and then the boys left, and the mesa that had echoed with their voices fell quiet for a few weeks before filling with a very different kind of sound, the hammering and sawing and diesel roar of the United States Army Corps of Engineers building a secret city from scratch. What happened next was one of the most extraordinary feats of rapid construction in American history, and it looked, from the inside, like total chaos. The original estimate of 30 scientists was obsolete before the first nail was driven. The scale of the bomb project kept expanding, and with it, the population of the mesa. By late summer 1943, hundreds of people were arriving monthly. By 1944, the number on the hill, residents called it the Hill, always, was in the low thousands. By the spring of 1945, the population had reached somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000, depending on whether you counted the military police, the construction crews, and the indigenous workers from nearby pueblos who were hired for labor but given even less information than anyone else about what was being built. The construction was fast and cheap and deliberately temporary. The Army did not intend for this city to last beyond the war. The M.M. Sunt Construction Company, based in Tucson, was the principal contractor, and the buildings they put up reflected wartime urgency rather than any aspiration to permanence. Military-style apartment buildings went up in rows, 4-unit and 8-unit structures of green-painted wood, prefabricated with thin walls and shared bathroom facilities. Family housing was small, 2 or 3 rooms for a scientist, a spouse, and however many children they happened to have. Single scientists and junior researchers were packed into dormitories that one resident later compared to Army barracks with slightly better plumbing. The streets were unpaved, and in the afternoon thunderstorms common to the New Mexico summer, they became rivers of mud. In the dry months, the dust was relentless. Wives reported sweeping their floors 4 and 5 times a day. Water was chronically scarce. The mesa had limited natural supply, and the system that had served 50 schoolboys could not easily serve 6,000 residents. The plumbing, hastily installed, was unreliable in the way that becomes legendary. Pipes froze, burst, leaked. Hot water was a rumor in some buildings. But there was one magnificent exception to the austerity, and it became perhaps the most famous piece of real estate in the secret city. A row of houses from the original ranch school, the master's cottages, solidly built of log and stone, had a feature that no other housing on the hill possessed: bathtubs. Everywhere else, The apartments had only showers, and low-pressure ones at that. These few houses, with their real bathtubs and their thick walls and their fireplaces, were reserved for the most senior scientists. Oppenheimer lived in one. So did Enrico Fermi when he arrived. Hans Bethe, who headed the theoretical division, had one. The rest of the mesa called the street Bathtub Row, and the name stuck not just as geography, but as the community's sharpest piece of social commentary. In a city where everyone held a security clearance and many held doctorates, and some held ideas that would reshape the world, the truest measure of status was whether you could take a bath. To reach this city, you first had to pass through a doorway that deserves its own place in this story. At 109 East Palace Avenue in Santa Fe's Old Plaza District, behind an arched entrance and a blue door, there was an unmarked office. This was where you reported when you arrived to work at the secret laboratory. Every physicist, every chemist, every machinist, every secretary, every soldier's wife, they all came first to 109 East Palace, where a woman named Dorothy McKibben sat behind a desk and welcomed them to a job she was not permitted to describe in a place she was not permitted to name. McKibben was a Smith College graduate, a widow, a Santa Fe native who had been hired on the strength of her warmth and organizational ability. She became the gatekeeper, not in the bureaucratic sense, but in the human one. She handed out temporary passes, arranged rides up the hill, answered questions she wasn't allowed to answer with enough grace that people stopped asking, and in many cases provided the only reassuring face a bewildered newcomer would see before disappearing into the classified world above. Years later, scientists who had won Nobel Prizes would say that Dorothy McKibben's calm smile at 109 East Palace was the first thing they remembered about coming to Los Alamos. From Santa Fe, you drove north along a narrow road that climbed through pinon and juniper and then switched back steeply onto the plateau. At the top, you hit the gate, a military checkpoint manned by armed guards from the Army's military police detachment, with a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire stretching in both directions into the trees. You showed your badge, a photograph, a number, no name, and if you were cleared, the gate swung open, and you entered a world that from the outside might as well not have existed. The fence enclosed not just the laboratories, but the entire community, the homes, the schools, the hospital, the recreation hall, the commissary where you bought your groceries, the movie theater where you watched films on Saturday nights. Everything inside the fence belonged to the federal government. Nobody owned property. Nobody paid rent in any meaningful sense. Housing was assigned based on rank, and the assignment was not negotiable. The Army ran the water, the electricity, the store, the garbage collection, the fire department. There was no mayor, no city council, no zoning board. There were, technically, no citizens at all, only employees and their dependents, living in government housing on government land behind a government fence, in a city the government insisted did not exist. The security, even by wartime standards, was extraordinary. All outgoing mail was opened, read by military censors, and resealed before it left the mesa. Incoming mail was similarly inspected. Residents could not mention the name Los Alamos, could not describe the landscape, could not reference the altitude, the weather, or the number of people around them. Long-distance telephone calls were monitored and, in practice, prohibited for most residents. Scientists who traveled off the hill, which required written permission, were instructed not to acknowledge each other in public, lest someone notice that a statistically improbable number of physicists seemed to be congregating in the same corner of New Mexico. Oppenheimer's name could not be spoken outside the fence. Within the compound, he was Oppie to nearly everyone, but official correspondents used code names. When Enrico Fermi traveled to the site, his cover name was Henry Farmer. Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist who arrived in late 1943 after a harrowing escape from Nazi-occupied Copenhagen, became Nicholas Baker. Edward Teller was Ed Tilden. The absurdity was deliberate. If a name couldn't be leaked, a connection couldn't be made. And the absurdity extended into every corner of daily life. Driver's licenses issued to residents listed no home address. Scientists publishing academic papers on unclassified topics could not list Los Alamos as their institutional affiliation. When residents died, their death certificates were as vague as their birth certificates. Place of death, P.O. Box 1663. One physicist later recalled trying to buy car insurance and being told his application was incomplete because he had failed to provide an address. He had no address to provide. He lived in a box number. And yet inside the fence, something entirely unexpected was taking root. A community, a real one, with all the warmth and friction and absurd mundanity that the word implies. The people on the hill were young. Oppenheimer was 38 when the project began. Most of his division leaders were in their 30s, and many of the junior scientists were barely past their doctoral work. Their wives, and they were overwhelmingly wives, in the social structure of 1940s America, were often formidably educated themselves, women with degrees in physics or chemistry or mathematics who found themselves, behind the fence, with no laboratory access and no official scientific role. Some took jobs as human computers, performing calculations by hand in a pool supervised by a mathematician named Donald Flanders, who went by the nickname Moll. Some taught at the school that had been hastily organized for the growing number of children. Others threw themselves into the social machinery that kept the community from flying apart under the pressure of secrecy and isolation and dust and bad plumbing. There were square dances on Saturday nights in Fuller Lodge, the old ranch school dining hall, its 800 logs now witness to a very different kind of gathering. A caller was found among the residents, a band assembled from scientists who played fiddle or guitar, and the dances became the social center of the hill, a place where a Nobel laureate might swing his partner alongside a machinist from the shop floor. There were lectures on topics unrelated to the classified work, poetry, music, history, philosophy, because when you gather that density of intellect in one place and cut off access to the outside world, boredom becomes a genuine threat to morale. There was a mimeographed newsletter. There was a small lending library. There was skiing in the Jemez Mountains in winter, hiking in the canyons in summer, and fishing in the mountain streams. There was also drinking, a considerable amount of it. The commissary stocked spirits, and the parties on the hill were, by many accounts, remarkable for their intensity. People drank and argued about quantum mechanics, and danced and had affairs, and fought about politics, and formed lifelong friendships, all within a few hundred yards of laboratories, where the weapon that would end the war was slowly taking shape. It was, in its way, a strange and brilliant little civilization, and nearly everyone who lived through it described it afterward with a mixture of nostalgia and disquiet that never fully resolved. The children noticed less than their parents assumed. They rode their bikes. They played in the canyons. They knew their parents worked in laboratories, but the word bomb was never spoken at home, and most children assumed their parents were doing something scientific and uninteresting. They knew there was a fence and guards, and that their address was peculiar. They did not know they were growing up at the center of the most consequential scientific project in human history. The work itself was conducted in a cluster of buildings called the technical area, a compound within the compound, separated from the residential section by its own security perimeter. Even within Los Alamos, not everyone could enter the tech area. The compartmentalization was a point of fierce contention between Groves and Oppenheimer. Groves believed, as security doctrine, that no individual should know more than their specific task required. Oppenheimer argued, passionately and repeatedly, that the scientific problems were so interlocked, so unprecedented, that cutting researchers off from each other's findings would cripple the work. Oppenheimer won the essential fight. The weekly colloquia, held in the old theater building, became legendary. Sessions where the full scope of the project's progress was laid before the assembled scientists, where questions could be asked across division lines, where a metallurgist's observation might solve a theoretician's problem. Groves never liked it, but the bombs got built. The budget for this enterprise, the laboratories, the housing, the roads, the security, the equipment, every nail and every physicist, was hidden inside the War Department's accounts with financial secrecy that matched the physical secrecy on the mesa. The total cost of the Manhattan Project would eventually reach approximately $2 billion in 1945 currency, roughly 28 to 30 billion in today's money. Los Alamos represented a meaningful fraction of that total, though exact figures for the site alone are difficult to isolate from the broader program's accounts, which were designed to be difficult to isolate. The money flowed without normal congressional oversight. When Senator Harry Truman, then chairing a committee investigating wartime waste, began asking questions about the enormous unexplained expenditures in New Mexico and Tennessee, Secretary of War Henry Stimson personally asked him to stop. Truman agreed. A sitting senator walked away from a $2 billion question on the strength of a request to trust. He would not learn what the money had purchased until April 1945, when Franklin Roosevelt died and Truman, suddenly president, was briefed on the weapon his own government had been building without his knowledge. By the spring of 1945, the work on the Mesa was nearing its culmination. Two bomb designs were being pursued. One, codenamed Little Boy, used enriched uranium, 235, and a relatively straightforward gun-type detonation mechanism, one subcritical mass fired into another at high speed. The scientists were confident enough in the physics that they believed it would work without a full-scale test. The other design, codenamed Fat Man, used plutonium-239 and a far more complex implosion mechanism, a sphere of shaped conventional explosives that, detonated with microsecond precision, would compress a plutonium core to supercriticality. The implosion design was uncertain. The tolerances were excruciating. It needed a test. That test came on July 16, 1945, at a site in the Jornada del Muerto Desert, roughly 200 miles south of Los Alamos. The site was codenamed Trinity, a name Oppenheimer chose, most likely inspired by a John Donne sonnet, though he gave contradictory explanations over the years and may simply have liked the weight of the word. In the pre-dawn darkness, a small group of scientists and military officials gathered at observation points miles from a 100-foot steel tower on which the plutonium device sat. The weather was poor, thunderstorms had delayed the test, and the tension was almost unbearable. Enrico Fermi, with the dark humor the situation seemed to demand, offered side bets on whether the bomb would ignite the atmosphere and destroy the state of New Mexico or merely the surrounding counties. It was not entirely a joke. Edward Teller had run the calculations. The probability was vanishingly small, but vanishingly small is not zero, and on that morning, mathematics had a different texture than it did in a lecture hall. At 5:29 a.m., the device detonated. The flash was visible more than 100 miles away. The blast wave knocked observers off their feet at 10 miles. A rancher's wife in a distant town thought the sun had risen in the wrong direction. The fireball climbed into a mushroom cloud that reached above 38,000 feet. The steel tower, 100 feet of bolted metal, was completely vaporized. At ground zero, the sand of the desert floor was fused into a green, glassy, mildly radioactive substance that would later be named Trinitite. The yield was approximately 21 kilotons, far larger than some predictions, confirming that the implosion design worked and worked powerfully. Oppenheimer, watching from a shelter about 6 miles away, later said that a line from the Bhagavad Gita had passed through his mind. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Kenneth Bainbridge, the physicist who had directed the test, turned to Oppenheimer and said something less literary and perhaps more accurate. "Now we are all sons of bitches." News of the test's success reached the Hill quickly. There was elation. It worked. The years of exhausting effort had paid off. And something else beneath it, harder to name. They had built the thing they came to build. The implications were beginning to arrive. 3 weeks later, on August 6th, a B-29 named the Enola Gay dropped the uranium bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, a plutonium bomb, the same design proven at Trinity, fell on Nagasaki. The combined death toll, including those who died from radiation exposure in the weeks and months that followed, was estimated at between 130,000 and 226,000 people, the overwhelming majority of them civilians. When the news of Hiroshima reached Los Alamos, the reaction was volcanic and contradictory. For the first time in over 2 years, the secret was out. Residents could say, to themselves and to the world, what they had been doing on that mesa. The word atomic was suddenly in every newspaper on the planet, and the return address on it was their home. There were celebrations, crowds gathering on the unpaved streets, cheering, drinking, a release of pressure so intense it resembled joy, even when it wasn't entirely joy. But as the photographs and reports from Japan filtered back, the flattened city blocks, the shadows burned into concrete, the hospitals overwhelmed with radiation victims, the mood shifted. Some scientists remained convinced the bombs had been necessary to end the war and save the lives that a land invasion of Japan would have cost. Others were shattered. Oppenheimer, in a meeting with his staff, reportedly said he felt he had blood on his hands. The community that had been bound together by secrecy was now bound by something heavier, shared authorship of a weapon that could not be uninvented. And then came the question nobody had fully prepared for. What now? The city had been built for one purpose, and that purpose was achieved. The war ended in August 1945. Scientists began leaving in waves, returning to the universities that had loaned them to the government. Oppenheimer resigned as director in October 1945 and returned to academic life, eventually becoming director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. For a few months, it seemed plausible that Los Alamos would simply close, that the temporary buildings would be torn down, the fence removed, and the mesa returned to the ponderosas and the canyon wrens. It did not happen, and the reason it did not happen arrived with brutal clarity on August 29, 1949, when the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb at a test site in Kazakhstan, years ahead of American intelligence estimates. One of the reasons it happened so fast was that all the extraordinary security on the mesa, the censored mail, the coded names, the fence, the gate, the armed guards, had failed to catch a spy living among the scientists. Klaus Fuchs was a German-born British physicist, quiet and well-liked, who had worked in the theoretical division at Los Alamos from 1944 to 1946. He was also a Soviet agent. Throughout his time on the Hill, Fuchs had passed detailed technical information about the implosion bomb design to a Soviet courier named Harry Gold during meetings in Santa Fe, the same Santa Fe where Dorothy McKibben welcomed newcomers through the Blue Door on East Palace Avenue. The information Fuchs provided was, by the assessment of historians of the nuclear programs, among the most valuable intelligence the Soviet effort received. He was not identified until 1950, and then only through a decrypted Soviet cable. He confessed, was convicted in Britain, and served 9 years. The city that had been hidden from the world had itself been hiding a man who gave its deepest secrets away. The Soviet test and the Fuchs revelation changed the strategic calculus entirely. The United States was not going to disarm, and now it was in an arms race. The newly created Atomic Energy Commission, which assumed control of the nation's nuclear facilities from the military in January 1947, needed a weapons laboratory, and Los Alamos already existed. A new director, Norris Bradbury, a Navy officer and physicist with more patience for administration than Oppenheimer had ever possessed, took over and began the painstaking work of converting a wartime crash program into a permanent national institution. The laboratory would develop the hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear weapon hundreds of times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb, and Los Alamos would remain at the center of America's nuclear arsenal for the remainder of the century and beyond. Oppenheimer opposed the hydrogen bomb. He argued it was unnecessary, even immoral, and the secret city had not finished with him. In 1954, at the height of McCarthyism, Oppenheimer was subjected to a security hearing by the Atomic Energy Commission, the very body that ran the laboratory he had created. His pre-war associations with communist sympathizers, his opposition to the super, and the enmity of powerful figures including Edward Teller and AEC Chairman Lewis Strauss were marshaled to strip him of his security clearance. The man who had directed the most consequential secret in American history was declared a security risk and banished from the classified world he had built. He could no longer set foot in the tech area at Los Alamos. The mesa went on without him. But the town wrapped around the laboratory was still, in every practical sense, a federal installation with families living in it. The government still owned every house, every lot, every building, every utility line. Those green, temporary, built-to-last 2 years apartments were still standing in 1947, in 1950, in 1955. Their walls slightly thinner with each winter, their plumbing elevated from unreliable to folkloric. Residents could not buy their homes, could not renovate without approval, could not plant a garden without permission from a bureaucracy that was also their employer, their landlord, their police department, and their only source of income. There was still no elected government. The Zia Company, a contractor, managed the town's municipal services under AEC oversight, mowing the lawns and fixing the pipes of houses that belonged to nobody who lived in them. The strangeness of this arrangement became harder to tolerate as the years went on, and the Cold War settled into permanence. The scientists and engineers who stayed, and many stayed, drawn by the work and by the strange beauty of the mesa, wanted what Americans everywhere wanted: to own a house, to vote for a mayor, to build a deck without filing a federal request. In 1949, the New Mexico state legislature created Los Alamos County, granting the community a formal existence within the state's political structure, even though the federal government still owned the ground it stood on. But the pressure for something more, real property, real self-governance, continued to build. The Atomic Energy Community Act of 1955 finally provided the mechanism. Under its terms, the government would sell the residential properties at Los Alamos to their occupants and to the municipal government that would be established to receive them. The process was slow, contentious, and full of the kind of surreal bureaucratic tangles that arise when the federal government attempts to create a real estate market from nothing. What was a house worth when it had been built in 6 weeks from green lumber by wartime contractors who never expected it to stand for 5 years, let alone 12? What was a lot worth when no private sale had ever established a comparable price in the entire history of the community? Appraisals had to be essentially invented. Some residents got bargains. Some felt they were overpaying for structures that should have been condemned. The arguments were fierce and thoroughly American. People who could design a nuclear weapon reduced to shouting about property assessments. The gate came down in 1957. Not all at once. The laboratory itself remained behind its own security perimeter, as it does to this day. But the fence around the residential community was removed, and the military checkpoints on the access road were dismantled. For the first time since February 1943, you could drive up to the mesa without showing a badge. For the first time, the town had a real address, real street names printed on real signs, a place on the map. The psychological effect was immense. Residents who had spent years in a community defined by its enclosure suddenly lived in a place defined by its view. That same staggering panorama across the Rio Grande Valley to the Sangre de Cristos that Oppenheimer had loved as a young man, visible now not through chain link but from a front porch you could, at last, actually own. But if the fence was gone, the fundamental character of Los Alamos was not. It was a company town before the gate came down, and it remained a company town after. The company was the United States government, operating through what became Los Alamos National Laboratory, and the town existed because the laboratory existed. This has not changed. As of recent years, the laboratory employs roughly 13,000 people, making it the largest single-site employer in New Mexico. The annual operating budget exceeds $3 billion. Los Alamos County's median household income is among the highest in the nation, well above $100,000, and the concentration of advanced degrees is without parallel. The county has been cited repeatedly as having more PhDs per capita than anywhere else in the United States. The public schools are lavishly funded by local property taxes paid on homes whose values reflect the salaries of nuclear physicists and weapons engineers. The crime rate is negligible, the hiking is superb, and the contrast with the communities below the mesa is stark. The nearby towns of Espanola and Pojoaque in the valley floor are among the poorest in New Mexico, a state that already ranks near the bottom nationally in income and education. The wealth on the mesa does not flow downhill in any proportionate way. Los Alamos exists as a kind of prosperous island, economically tethered to Washington, rather than to the landscape it physically occupies, and the disparity has been a source of tension for decades. And yet there has always been something uneasy about the prosperity of Los Alamos, something the community has wrestled with since the beginning. The wealth comes from weapons work. The excellent schools, and the well-maintained trails, and the stunning mesa-top views are all underwritten by a laboratory whose core mission, even as it has diversified into basic science and energy research and supercomputing, remains the stewardship and development of the American nuclear arsenal. The tension between the pleasantness of the place and the gravity of the work has never resolved. It has simply become part of the local atmosphere, an awareness that lives below the surface of the tidy streets and the farmers' market and the 4th of July parade, acknowledged by residents with a frankness that outsiders sometimes find unsettling and sometimes find admirable. The landscape, too, has reminded Los Alamos that nothing on a mesa is permanent. On May 4, 2000, a prescribed burn set by the National Park Service in nearby Bandelier National Monument jumped its containment lines and became the Cerro Grande fire. Wind-driven and explosive in the dry spring conditions, the fire raced across the plateau and into the town, destroying more than 230 homes and forcing the complete evacuation of the community, every man, woman, and child off the hill for the first time since the days before the Manhattan Project. The laboratory itself was threatened, several structures were damaged, and the presence of radioactive and hazardous materials stored across the lab's sprawling 40-square-mile campus added a dimension to the emergency that no fire department trains for. Total damages exceeded $1 billion. The fire burned through the ponderosa forests that had shaded the ranch schoolboys and given the mesa its beauty, leaving hillsides of black trunks and ash. When residents returned, the place they came home to was scarred and strange, the familiar tree-lined streets suddenly open to a sky that felt too large. Los Alamos rebuilt, as it has always rebuilt, quickly, pragmatically, without much public drama. The ponderosas are growing back, 30-foot trees now where there was char. New houses sit where old ones burned. The laboratory continues behind its fences. Smaller now than the wartime perimeter, but equipped with badge readers and security cameras that the Army MPs of 1943 could not have imagined. The old ranch school buildings that survived, and several did, including Fuller Lodge with its 800 hand-peeled logs, still stand at the historic core of the community, maintained now as landmarks. Fuller Lodge hosts art shows and community dinners in the same room where schoolboys ate breakfast and physicists danced. Drive up to Los Alamos today and you take a paved state highway that climbs from the Rio Grande Valley through a series of switchbacks onto the plateau. The same route, roughly, that the scientists traveled in 1943, though the road is wider now and nobody stops you at the top. The mesa opens up and you can see across the valley to the mountains where Oppenheimer rode horses in the summers before the world changed. The air is thin and sharp, the sky immense. The town looks, at first glance, like any prosperous small community in the American West. A few grocery stores, restaurants, a good public library, quiet residential streets. Nothing announces what happened here. But then you notice the badge readers at the laboratory gates, the security vehicles on the perimeter roads, the fact that the street names, Oppenheimer Drive, Trinity Drive, Bikini Atoll Road, are not the names of a town that has forgotten. They are the names of a town that lives inside its history every single day and has learned, as places do, to carry it while going about the business of being a place where people live. P.O. Box 1663 still exists. It is a working address at the Santa Fe Post Office, and it still belongs to Los Alamos National Laboratory. Mail sent there is delivered to the mesa, exactly as it has been since 1943. 83 years of letters, parcels, invoices, and documents, all routed through the same box number that once served as the birthplace of children who had no city, the home of laureates who had no address, and the only evidence the United States Postal Service possessed that a city of 6,000 brilliant, frightened, restless, world-altering people was up there on the mesa at all. The box is small and ordinary. It always was.